The gun was already on the table when Elena walked in. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood in the doorway of that cold, marble-floored office, rain hammering the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, and stared at the man she had agreed to pretend to love, the man who was now watching her with eyes that had never once been warm. "Close the door," Damian Voss said quietly. And that was the moment Elena Marsh understood that fake marriages to billionaire mafia bosses do not end with a handshake and a goodbye. They end when he decides they end. And Damian Voss had just decided. 3 months earlier, Elena had been desperate enough to say yes to anything. She just hadn't known that anything would cost her everything. Her life before Damian could be summarized in a single word: invisible. Elena was 31, a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Chicago, the kind of woman who arrived early and left late and still somehow never got promoted. She had a studio apartment with a radiator that clanged through the night, a cat named Fig who knocked things off shelves with deliberate contempt, and a savings account that looked at her the same way her ex-boyfriend Marcus had when he left, with profound disappointment. She wasn't broken. She was just tired. Tired of scraping, tired of calculating whether she could afford both groceries and her electricity bill, tired of watching people who work half as hard live twice as well. She wasn't asking for a miracle. She was just asking for enough. So when her college friend Dana called her on a Tuesday evening in October and said, "I know this sounds insane, but hear me out," Elena should have hung up. She didn't. Dana explained it with the clinical efficiency of someone who had clearly rehearsed. A man, wealthy, powerful, politically connected, needed a wife. Not a real wife. A surface wife. Someone to attend dinners and charity galas and family functions, to smile at the right moments and say the right things and make the world believe that Damian Voss, CEO of Voss Consolidated and rumored head of the most sophisticated organized crime network in the Midwest, was a settled, respectable family man. Why? Elena had asked. "Business," Dana said. "There's a major acquisition. European investors. Old money. They don't trust unmarried men. Something about stability." "And why me?" Dana paused. "Because you're smart enough to pull it off and broke enough to need the money." The number she quoted next made Elena sit down on her kitchen floor. $500,000 for 6 months. A contract. Legal language. An NDA so airtight it had apparently taken 3 law firms to draft. She would live in his home, attend his events, answer to the name Mrs. Voss, and otherwise stay out of his way. He would stay out of hers. Elena said she'd think about it. She called back in 4 hours. The first time she met Damian Voss in person, she almost turned around and walked out. He was taller than she'd expected, which was saying something because Dana had warned her. Dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with a kind of face that looked like it had been carved rather than born, sharp jaw, sharper eyes, a mouth that seemed to have forgotten what smiling felt like. He wore his suit the way other men wore armor. He shook her hand once, brief and businesslike, and then gestured to the chair across from his desk as though she were a contractor he was mildly annoyed to be meeting with. "You understand what this is," he said. It wasn't a question. "A transaction," Elena said. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth. More like the faint recognition that she wasn't going to be as simple as he'd assumed. "Correct. You will be introduced as my wife at the Aldrich group dinner in 3 weeks. Between now and then, you'll learn the necessary background. My assistant will provide materials." "Materials," Elena repeated. "Our meeting story. My family history. Preferences, habits, the things a wife would know." He looked at her steadily. "I don't have time for mistakes." "And I don't make them," Elena said. She surprised herself. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he pressed a button on his desk and said, "Send Miriam in." That was their entire first conversation. Elena signed the contract that afternoon. But nothing, not the briefing documents Miriam provided, not the 3 days of preparation, not Dana's breezy assurances that it was just dinner, just smiling, just playing a part. Nothing had prepared Elena for what it actually felt like to stand beside Damian Voss in a ballroom full of people who all believed she was his wife. She had expected to feel fraudulent. She did. But she had not expected to feel something else underneath that, something unsettlingly close to belonging. He was a different person in public. Not warmer, not softer, but present in a way he wasn't behind closed doors, where he moved through his own home like a ghost who'd forgotten he lived there. In public, Damian Voss commanded every room he entered, and Elena, standing at his side, became, almost despite herself, part of that command. He introduced her with his hand at the small of her back. He answered questions about how they met with a version of the truth so close to plausible that Elena almost believed it herself. When a particularly persistent investor's wife cornered Elena near the bar and began probing for details about their relationship, Damian appeared at her elbow within 60 seconds, slid his arm around her waist, and said, with absolute convincing ease, "Sorry to steal her. She promised me the next dance." There was no dance. He simply guided her away, leaned down, and murmured near her ear, "Renata Aldrich gossips to her husband, who gossips to his partners. Never give her more than 30 seconds. How did you know she was fishing?" Elena whispered. "Because everyone in this room is fishing," he said. "You learn to recognize the hooks." She should have written that down. As a warning to herself. They didn't speak much in the weeks that followed. The house, a compound, really, set behind iron gates in a neighborhood where the hedges were tall enough to hide secrets, had enough space that they orbited each other without collision. Elena had her wing. He had his. Meals were delivered and largely eaten separately. His staff, a small army of discreet, competent people who asked no questions and answered all of hers with polite efficiency, treated her with the same careful professionalism they treated everything in Damian Voss's life. It was comfortable, in the way that expensive, well-maintained loneliness is always comfortable. Then one evening she found him in the kitchen at midnight. He was standing at the counter eating leftover pasta from a container with a fork, still in his dress shirt, jacket gone, reading something on his phone. He looked up when she walked in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "I didn't think you knew where the kitchen was," Elena said. "I own the kitchen." "That's not the same thing." He looked at her again. That same slight shift, not amusement, but adjacent to it. "There's more in the refrigerator," he said. "Second shelf." She got the container. She stood at the opposite counter and ate. He kept reading. "After a while," he said, without looking up, "you handled the Mocchetti conversation well last week. He's difficult." "He's just nervous," Elena said. "He keeps checking whether people respect him. So I asked about his daughter's lacrosse tournament." She paused. He talked for 20 minutes and forgot whatever he was worried about. Damian looked up from his phone. This time the look lasted longer. "Where did you learn that?" "Being invisible for 31 years, she said. "You notice things when nobody's watching you." He said nothing. But he didn't look away. That was the first conversation that felt real. Elena told herself it didn't matter. She told herself that for a long time. The problems started arriving in the third month. She didn't see them clearly at first. Only in pieces. A conversation he ended too abruptly when she entered a room, a phone call taken outside despite the cold, the way his assistant Miriam sometimes looked at Elena with something that wasn't quite pity but was close enough to make her stomach tighten. Then came the night of the Voss family dinner. Damian had 3 siblings, or rather, 2 siblings and a half-brother no one acknowledged comfortably. His older sister Corinne was elegant and blade-sharp and looked at Elena from across the table like she was a sum that hadn't been properly carried. His younger brother Felix was charming in the reckless way of men who'd never needed to try, and he refilled Elena's wine glass twice before she decided to stop accepting. The half-brother, Ren, arrived late and sat at the far end of the table and said almost nothing, but his eyes moved over Elena with an attention that felt like appraisal. After dinner, when Damian had stepped away, Corinne sat beside Elena with the smooth movement of a woman who had spent a lifetime taking positions. "You're better than the last one," she said pleasantly. Elena kept her expression neutral. "The last what?" "Don't." Corinne smiled. "It's not an insult. I just mean that you're smarter. The last arrangement was obvious from 6 feet away." She sipped her wine. "This one almost convinces me." "Almost," Elena said. "Almost," Corinne confirmed. Then, lower, "Be careful, Elena. My brother is not a man who lets things go. Whatever this is, when it ends, make sure you're the one who walks away. Because if he decides how it ends..." She stopped. Smile again, the kind that didn't reach anything. "Well, you seem smart enough to understand what I mean." Elena replayed that conversation for days afterward. Then the contract complication arrived, and everything began to move faster than she could track. The Aldrecht acquisition stalled. One of the European partners, a cold-eyed Belgian named Van der Meer, had apparently commissioned his own background investigation on Damian, and the report had surfaced something from 6 years ago that Damian's lawyers were now quietly working to contain. Elena didn't know the details. She only knew the fallout. The timeline was extending. Damian was absorbing a level of pressure she could feel radiating off him like heat from a closed room, and the neat 6-month arrangement was beginning to look less neat by the day. "The contract may need to be extended," Miriam told her one morning with the delivery of someone reading a weather forecast. By how much? Elena asked. Mr. Voss will discuss it with you. He didn't discuss it with her for 4 days. When he finally knocked on her sitting room door, something he had never done, and came in and sat across from her, Elena looked at him and thought, for the first time clearly, this man carries something terrible and he carries it completely alone. I need more time, he said simply. How much more time? 3 months, potentially 6. He met her eyes. The financial compensation would be renegotiated accordingly. I'm not worried about the money, Elena said, and realized she meant it, which was a different kind of problem than the one they were supposedly discussing. He looked at her. What are you worried about? She should have said something practical. She said, instead, You look like something is coming and you've decided to let it. The silence that followed was the longest one they'd shared. Then Damian Voss said, very quietly, Nothing is coming that I can't handle. That's not an answer. No, he said. It's not. He left. But he left differently than he arrived. Something shifted in the composition of him, some almost imperceptible loosening around the jaw and shoulders, as though a man had been spoken to instead of worked with, and hadn't entirely known what to do with the difference. What Elena didn't know, what she couldn't have known from the briefing documents and background materials and careful performance of a wife who knew her husband, was what was actually buried in Damian Voss's history. She found out the way she found out most things about him, by being quiet while other people talked. It was Ren, the half-brother, who told her, not out of kindness, out of strategy, which was worse. He appeared at the house one afternoon when Damian was out, which Elena suspected was not a coincidence. Ren had the easy confidence of someone who had always existed slightly outside the rules that applied to everyone else, and he sat in the drawing room like he owned it and looked at Elena like he found her genuinely interesting, which put her on guard immediately. You know what Damian actually does, Ren said. Not the official version. The real version. I know what I need to know, Elena said carefully. That's a diplomatic answer. He smiled. He runs the most functional criminal organization this side of the Atlantic. Drugs, mostly. Some weapons. Significant money movement. The legitimate business is a very good jacket over a very complicated structure. He paused. He's also the only person who's ever made the Petrov Group step back without a single body dropped, which is either genius or something so frightening they decided the math wasn't worth it. Why are you telling me this? Elena asked. Because Van der Meer isn't just a business problem, Ren said. He's the Petrov Group's money man in Europe, and is not investigating Damian's background because of the acquisition. He's investigating because someone paid him to find something that can be used. He let that settle. And because my brother, for the first time in approximately 15 years, has a person in his house he actually talks to, which makes you a liability, or a lever, depending on who's doing the math. After he left, Elena sat for a long time without moving. Fig would have knocked something off a shelf right now, she thought absurdly. Just to make a point. She should have packed. She should have called her lawyer, the one she'd hired with her own money at the start of the contract, quietly, against the possibility of exactly this kind of moment. Instead, she waited for Damian to come home. Why didn't you tell me about Van der Meer? She asked him that night. He was still, the way he went still when something caught him off guard. Where did you hear that name? Ren came by. Something moved through Damian's expression, controlled fury, brief and buried. What did he tell you? Enough. Elena kept her voice even. Enough to understand that I am currently living inside a situation that is significantly more dangerous than a corporate dinner circuit. You're not in danger, he said. You don't know that. Elena. Don't, she said. Don't give me the version you give everyone else. I am not everyone else. I've spent 3 months learning how to be a wife, and apparently I got too good at it because somewhere along the way I stopped being careful, and now I'm standing in your house at 11 o'clock at night actually concerned about what happens to you, which was extremely not part of the contract, so the least you can do is tell me the truth. The silence was different this time. Not closed. Open in a way that made it dangerous. Damian Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down." And he told her, not everything. She understood later that there were parts of his life, specific years, specific decisions, specific costs, that he would carry alone until he died. But he told her enough. Enough to understand what Van der Meer was looking for, which was evidence of a transaction from 6 years ago that had served as the founding movement of the Petrov Group's Chicago operation and had Damian's name on it, not as participant but as the man who had shut it down and redirected it, permanently, through methods that left no bodies and fewer legal threads, but were nonetheless not the kind of thing that survived a Belgian investigator with the right motivation. He told her about his father, the man who had built the original empire and handed Damian both the power and the debt of it on his deathbed, as though they were the same inheritance. He told her about the choice he'd made at 26, take it apart slowly, from the inside, redirect toward legal structures, absorb the relationships without inheriting all the violence. Not because he was noble, because he was calculating, and the calculation over a long enough horizon showed him that blood was the least efficient currency. You're not actually what people think you are, Elena said slowly. I'm exactly what people think I am, he said. I've just been working on different timelines. And von der Meer is a problem I'm handling. Is it a problem that involves me? He looked at her. She had learned by now how to read the things his face didn't say. Not if I handle it correctly, he said, which was not the same as no. She should have been frightened. She was, a little. But underneath the fear was something she hadn't felt in years, the precise, clarifying sensation of being exactly where she needed to be. She didn't examine that too closely. The Van der Meer situation came to its head on a Friday in December, 3 weeks before her original contract was supposed to end. She didn't know the details of what Damian did. She only knew that Miriam appeared in her doorway at 7 in the morning with the expression of someone who had been awake all night and said, "There may be guests this weekend. Mr. Voss asks that you stay close to the house." And then 2 days of strange quiet, no staff movement, vehicles in the drive she didn't recognize, Damian moving through rooms with the particular contained focus she'd come to understand meant he was managing something at the edge of what he could manage. And then Sunday evening, the house went still. Damian appeared in the doorway of the library where she was pretending to read, and he looked different. Not relaxed. Damian Voss was never relaxed, but settled. Like a question that had finally answered itself. "It's handled," he said. "Von der Meer won't be pursuing any investigations." Elena looked at him. "Are you going to tell me how?" "No." "Are you going to tell me if anyone was hurt?" A pause. "No." She nodded slowly. "Okay." He looked at her like he was waiting for the next question. She didn't ask it. Some things were carried between the words. Then he said, very quietly, "The contract ends in 3 weeks." "I know." "You can leave then. Everything as agreed." The fire cracked in the grate. Rain outside. It was always raining in these moments of her life, she thought. Some kind of narrative insistence. "What if I don't want to leave in 3 weeks?" Elena said. She wasn't sure she'd intended to say it aloud. She knew she meant it. The silence that followed was the longest and the most specific of all the silences she'd catalogued since moving into this house. "That," Damian said finally, "is a different kind of arrangement." "I'm aware." "It doesn't become simpler. What I am doesn't become simpler." "I know what you are," Elena said. "I've known for months. I'm still here." He looked at her, really looked, the way he sometimes did when he forgot to keep the distance managed, and in his face she saw something she'd never seen there before. Not softness, exactly. Something rawer than softness. The expression of a man who had spent 15 years making sure that nothing and no one could be used against him, confronting the fact that somewhere along the way he had failed at that completely, and was not entirely sure he minded. "You'd have to sign a different contract," he said. "I'm a good accountant," Elena said. "I read contracts carefully." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The ghost of one. The suggestion that a smile had once lived there and might, given sufficient reason, consider returning. 3 weeks, he said. "When the original contract ends. We discuss it then." She should have known that 3 weeks was too long. That in the life of Damian Voss, 3 weeks contained multitudes. The call came on a Thursday, 12 days before the contract's end. She was in the kitchen, their kitchen, by now, the midnight pasta counter having become a strange recurring ritual, when she heard his voice from down the hall in a register she'd never heard before. Not controlled. Not managed. Something underneath the control. Raw, in a way that frightened her because she'd come to believe he didn't have access to raw. She didn't go immediately. She waited. When he appeared 20 minutes later in the kitchen doorway, he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on him and could not fully name. "My brother," he said. "Just that." "Ren?" she asked. "He's made an arrangement with the Petrov Group. A direct line. In exchange for evidence about the Chicago transaction." A pause. "He's known about it for years. He kept it as insurance." Another pause. Longer. "Against me." Elena set down her cup. Damian. It doesn't change the outcome, he said, with the precise, practiced steadiness of a man locking something into a box. I'll manage it. That's not what I was going to say. He looked at her. I was going to say that I'm sorry, Elena said. That's terrible. He's your brother and that's a terrible thing and you're allowed to feel that. The box he'd been locking held for another moment. Then, quietly, almost inaudibly, I know. She crossed the kitchen and sat beside him at the counter. She didn't touch him. She just stayed close, in the way that sometimes words aren't the point and proximity is the whole language. After a long while, he said, You make it complicated. Being here. Caring, he said. You make caring look easy. I'd forgotten it looked like that. It's not easy, Elena said. I've just had a lot of practice caring about things that don't know they matter. He turned and looked at her then, fully, without the management, without the distance, and Elena understood that this was the moment. Not one of the dramatic moments, not the dinners or the confrontations or the revelations. This one. Two people at a kitchen counter in the middle of the night, the rain outside, the house quiet. Stay, Damian said. Not as a command. As the first honest request she'd ever heard him make. She stayed. The next 12 days were a controlled unraveling. Damian's lawyers worked to contain the Wren situation, which resolved in a way Elena still doesn't know the full details of and has decided she doesn't need to. The Aldrecht acquisition closed. The Belgian investors signed. The world outside the iron gates continued its ordinary rotation. And inside, something quieter and stranger and more real than any of it. He left the gun on the table the morning after she told him she was staying, and when she walked in and saw it she asked him flatly what that was about, and he said, I wanted to see if it would make you reconsider. She'd looked at him, looked at the gun, and said, Put that away, it's a terrible centerpiece. And he had. And that was that. It wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't neat. Damian Voss was difficult in all the ways she'd always known he would be, controlled to the point of distance, work consumed, occasionally infuriating in the way of people who have spent too many years relying only on themselves. And Elena was stubborn and independent, and had a cat named Fig who arrived in the house like a small destructive ambassador and immediately claimed Damian's reading chair. He did not remove the cat from the chair. Elena considered this data. What she would say afterward, when she tried to explain it to Dana, who had called her the morning after she stayed and said, Elena, what are you doing? In the tone of someone watching a friend walk into traffic, was this. Some arrangements begin as transactions and end as truth. Some people spend their whole lives performing a version of themselves that's slightly less than real, and then they stand across from someone who already knows the performance and chooses them anyway, and something in them goes quiet. Not gone. Just quiet. She hadn't been looking for Damian Voss. She'd been looking for $500,000 and a way to stop being invisible. What she found was a man who had spent 15 years making himself impossible to reach, sitting across from her in a kitchen at midnight eating leftover pasta, saying stay, like it was the hardest word in his vocabulary. It probably was. She stayed anyway. If you're watching this story play out and wondering how it ends, it doesn't. Not in the neat way of contracts and conclusions. Elena is still learning the parts of Damian he's willing to show. He's still learning that someone knowing you and staying is not the same thing as a trap. Fig has knocked a very expensive vase off the mantel and Damian is pretending he doesn't find this funny. Elena is not pretending. The work continues. The world outside the gates remains complicated. But inside, in the kitchen, with the rain on the windows and the fire in the grate, there are two people who looked at each other with full information and chose to stay in the room. That's not nothing. In fact, in Elena Marsh's experience, that's everything. If this story kept you watching until the end, drop a comment below. Tell me whose side you were on when Elena signed that contract. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and hit the bell. The next one is already darker, and you're not going to see the ending coming. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.